All right, that is set up. Take that. Get it centered. And I think we are set. Let me just double check that YouTube is up and running. It is, or at least it tells me it is, and that's all I can go by. All right, good afternoon to everyone. It is nice to see everybody. So we are in Parashat Kedoshim, which is one of the most amazing sections in the entire Torah, containing some of the most famous lines, such as to love one's neighbor as yourself. And we are not going to touch that section. We've talked about it before. We need to talk about other things. Now, what we're going to talk about is one of the big three. The first two are much better known. If I were to tell you what are the most critical transgressions that a person should never violate, what are the three big no-nos, thou shalt nots in Judaism, that according to our tradition, a person should even lay down their life rather than transgress, you'd probably come up with the first two without too much trouble. Murder, right off the top, of course, I should never murder another person under any circumstances, even to save my own life. The second, sexual infidelity. I should never commit adultery or incest, for example, even to save my own life. The third, on the other hand, well, the third is idolatry. And for most of us, that does not generate the same emotional response as the first two. And that is something that our tradition understands. That is not a new liberal position that for some reason we're, just not feeling the problem of idolatry as much as our ancestors used to. Our ancestors, too, did not feel that idolatry was in the same category. The Torah definitely does, but the rank and file did not. We've already seen evidence of that from the people who left the land of Egypt by their building of the golden calf. And we will see that throughout other incidences in the Torah, as well as countless generations throughout the rest of Tanakh, throughout the rest of the Bible. So clearly, people were very comfortable and cozy with idolatry, even if they were not with the other transgressions in Judaism. And that's kind of weird, because why does the Torah have such a problem if we do not instinctually have such a problem? What is such a big deal about idolatry? And that is what we're going to look at. But we're going to look at it in a very special case. In one hand, the worst case, and on the other hand, a completely minor case. And from our commentary, hopefully we'll understand how one case of idolatry can be both at the same time. And from an analysis of this unique situation, perhaps we can come to a better understanding of the insidiousness of idolatry and why it is considered such a problem. So, with all of that as my intro, we are on chapter 20 of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, and we are starting with verse number 1. And Adonai spoke to Moses, the classic introduction of a section. Say further to the Israelite people, or rather just say to the Israelite people, anyone among the Israelites or among the strangers residing in Israel who give any offspring to Molech shall be put to death. The people of the land shall pelt the person with stones. We're going to come back to this in much more detail, but just a general explanatory note on this. Molech was one of the ancient gods in the Near East, and there were particular rites and rituals that went along with the worship of Molech. And as we're going to see, this giving of one's offspring, of one's progeny, of one's seed to Molech is a very particular type of ritual. And apparently, this ritual is being singled out for special attention among all of the types of rituals that went on in idolatrous practice. That makes it unusual, because why single out this particular form of idolatry? And we'll talk about what that ritual is in verse number 3. Let's talk about that in the next section here. And I will set my face against that party, or against that person, whom I will cut off from among the people for having given offspring to Molech, and so defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. Now, what exactly is going on here with defiling my sanctuary? Presumably, we're not doing the ritual of Molech at the Mishkan or at the temple in Jerusalem. So how can we say that this is defiling or causing to be ritually impure mikdashi, my holy place? And indeed, how can this even be considered a profanation of God's name? After all, God is not involved in this. This is some other religious activity. All very good questions that I'm sure you all had, which we will have to loop back to. And then verse 4. And if the person of the land should shut their eyes to that party's giving offspring to Molech and should not put the person to death, I myself will set my face against that party's kin as well, and I will cut off from among their people both that person and all who follow in going astray after Molech. So it's not 100% clear from the English translation, but what the Hebrew is trying to tell us here is that if you know that other people are participating in this Molech activity and you say nothing, if you shut your eyes to it, if you ignore it, that you as well will also be in trouble, meaning that God will also cut you off. You will be also among the list of people that are not going to be blessed, to say the least, by God. Yes, it's not quite as severe as doing it yourself, but the consequences, meaning the response from God, will be very similar to you as it was to the person actually performing the deed. That is how severe this activity was considered, that even a bystander that did nothing to put a stop to it would be considered guilty of a crime simply by doing nothing to put a stop to it. Verse 6, and if any person turns to ghosts and familiar spirits and goes astray after them, I will set my face against that person, whom I will cut off from among the people. We get an additional reminder that we are not allowed to consult with different forms of fortune telling or necromancy, and a similar idea that this will result in a person being cut off from God. And then the final two lines for our discussion today: you shall sanctify yourself and be holy, for I, Adonai, am your holy. You shall faithfully observe my laws. I, Adonai, make you holy. So you probably can tell why this Torah portion is called Kedoshim, because we have had the various forms of the word kadosh multiple times, and it's not only in chapter 20, in chapter 19 as well. The refrain of being holy, for God is holy, is a very familiar pattern. But what actually is going on here that causes a breach of holiness? How would consulting these spirits, or more importantly, participating in the activities of Molech, be considered some betrayal of God's holiness? What is God's beef about idolatry? Is it just petty jealousy that God doesn't like us to worship other things? Is it just some unusual form of anti-materialism that God doesn't like us worshiping an item? Why is God so passionately opposed to all of this? Now, that's partially a rhetorical question, and one that we're going to begin to look at the commentaries for in just a minute. But I also want to allow any room if people have ideas, suggestions, or questions about these verses that we've read so far. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at our commentary and see what we can make of Molech. I can zoom that in one more shot. There we go. Make it a little bit bigger. All right. So first of all, we have to understand, what is this giving of your child to Molech? What is actually happening? And this is hinted at in other forms of the Torah, and then more specifically in the Book of Kings. But Rambam gives us sort of the composite view from all of the sources of what is going on during this ritual that Leviticus is talking about. He who gives of his children to Molech of his own free will, deliberately, is guilty of an offense punishable by karet. Remember, karet is the idea of being cut off from God. It's also usually rendered in traditional understanding as you make yourself liable to death at the hand of heaven, meaning you have basically said to God, strike me down whenever you feel like it. If accidentally, meaning if you didn't realize that this was a giving to Molech, that this was what was meant, if you did it by mistake, then he should offer a standard sin offering. So far, the standard ideas of transgression. If he did it in the presence of witnesses and was given due warning, his punishment is stoning. So if there were witnesses, as opposed to doing it only in private, and if there was warning, which is always a requirement for any capital crime in Judaism, then the punishment would be stoning. Okay, how was this practice done? One builds a big fire and takes some of his children and turns them over to the fire-worshipping priests. Those priests, after a child has been turned over to them by the father to pass him through the fire by the father's consent, return the child back to the father. And it is the child, a father of the child, who passes his child through the fire by the consent of the priests. And the passing through thereof is by walking the victim from one side to the other in the midst of the flame. So you can just get the animated version. The father takes his children to the priest of Molech, and he says, I want my children to pass through the fire, and he hands them over to the priest. The priest accepts that child as being part of this special ceremony for Molech, and then, having sort of consecrated them for the activity, hands them back to the father, and then the father leads the child through the flames as a celebration, as a worship of Molech. Now, the practice, Rambam continues, was not to burn children to Molech outright, after the manner of those who burn their sons and daughters to another kind of idolatry, but only by passing through the flame was the service of this idol, which is called Molech. So he wants to differentiate, as we see from 2 Kings 17, that there were some ancient religions where people would put their children in the fire and kill them, that it was a form of a full murder and sacrifice of the child through the fire. Molech, on the other hand, was a ritual where the child was passed through the flames. Think of it like jumping over a bonfire, not standing in it, not being thrown into it, but being passed through those flames. Everyone have the idea? All right. Well, you're probably thinking, what's the big deal? Hold on. I mean, this is what is going to get you stoned, just having your kid jump through a bonfire. And I will point out, of course, we are talking about a bonfire for a particular purpose. We're not talking about something you got up to when you were a teenager on the beach, and all of the other kids were jumping through the fire, so you did it too. That was just stupid, not idolatry. This is talking about a very particular activity where it was done for the god Molech directly. But it's still, on the scale of things that are bad in the world, it doesn't feel like it's near the top of bad things. That whole incest and murder and that, yeah, that's pretty horrible. Having somebody walk through a little bit of fire, meh, this really is in that same category. All right, so now we need to figure out why it might be considered in that first category, and in that high category. But before we do that and get into the real nitty-gritty of what the problem is, there were two other comments that I didn't want to pass up the opportunity of sharing, because sometimes I just come across things I think need to be shared, and even if they're not part of the primary theme, I still think good to be seen. So the first comes from Chayei Mohoran. This is the biography written by Rabbi Nachman's student, Rabbi Natan, and it tried to summarize many of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslaw's teachings. And it says on this topic the following: on the subject of wars between nations and needless bloodshed, Rabbi Nachman said, many of the misguided follies which people in previous eras believed in, such as primitive cults like the child sacrifice to Molech, and so on, have now disappeared. Hooray, we no longer are doing this kind of Molech activity. But so far, the pursuit of war, misguided error that it is, has not been abolished. The Rebbe had contempt for the scientists who developed new weapons, saying, what great sages they must be to figure out how to make a wonderful weapon that can kill thousands of people at once. Is there anything more foolish than to kill so many people for nothing? So parallel to the idiocy of the idolatry of the ancient world, Rabbi Nachman believed that modern warfare likewise was idiotic, especially the pride that people would feel in the development of new ways of killing more and more people at one time. And not that I agree with Rabbi Nachman on every point, but in this, I think he was very astute, that we have left behind some of the stupidity of the past, but for some reason, warfare has not fully been consigned to the laughing stocks of history. May it soon come to pass that it is. And then the second is just a little clarification from Chizkuni on this idea of skila, this idea of stoning a person to death. And he points out the Hebrew word is talking about using a stone, the even or oven in the pausal form where it shows up in the verse. And he explains the use of the singular stone, meaning only one stone, means that only if the first stone failed to kill the convicted would anyone else throw any further stones. The Talmud and the Mishnah on Sanhedrin and Makot deal with this in great detail, that stoning in Jewish law was not like the scene in Life of Brian, where you have a bunch of people all throwing rocks randomly at the person that is condemned. That there was a very specific methodology that would require first the pushing of a person from an elevated platform so that they would strike the stone of the ground and be the main means of killing them. If that didn't work, then an additional large stone would be used. But the image of a bunch of people all throwing rocks is simply not how Judaism believed stoning was meant to take place. And like all forms of capital punishment in Jewish law, great discussion and debate was had about how to make sure that the fulfillment of this mitzvah would nonetheless be as painless and least humiliating as possible, perpetuating the idea that we love our neighbor as ourselves, even if capital punishment is required, that a person who has committed a capital crime has not ceased to be human, nor have our responsibilities to their dignity and their peace disappeared. Even if we had to take their life, it had to be done so in the least painful and least humiliating way possible. All right, so that digression aside, let's get down to work about what's going on with Molech and why this is such a big issue. And we're going to pick up with Seforno, the great commentator from the late Middle Ages, talking about this concept of idolatry and how it all fits together for us. After the Torah had explained God's plan to sanctify the Israelites in order for them to become as much like him as is possible for any creature, meaning the beginning of Parashat Kedoshim and all of the high ideals and teachings that are found in the early parts, and he taught them the path to achieve this aim, it now warns of a lifestyle which could produce the opposite result. All right, so first clue that Sforno is giving us here of why idolatry is such a problem is how it is juxtaposed, set up in opposition to the values and ideals of the path of holiness that we see earlier in the book of or in the parasha of Kedoshim. The idea of loving another as ourself and of having that proper spirit of holiness guiding our path. We now see in this chapter things that would be in opposition, things that would prevent that from happening, the literal flipping of direction. So the Torah discusses the penalty that would befall three specific categories of people who defied the Torah and take a different path toward what they perceive to be their success in life on this planet. People guilty of these practices would contaminate their souls beyond redemption. Now, beyond redemption is a little hyperbole. Of course, Teshuvah is always an option. People can always do atonement. But unfortunately, these three categories are of the type that many people, once they begin to engage in them, are exceedingly unlikely to turn back. There are certain behaviors that become self-perpetuating and become extremely hard for us to put aside. So these are the categories that he highlights. Category 1 are people who follow mistaken philosophies. A prime example being people who follow the cult of Molech. In verse 3 from our chapter 20, the Torah spelled out the spiritually negative consequences of following this cult with the words, "So defiled my holiness." Now, what Seforno is doing here is taking that mikdashi, that my holy place and my holiness, and saying it's not really about talking about God's Mishkan or God's temple. As I discussed when we first went through that verse, it's impossible to imagine that any of these behaviors were being done at the Mishkan or the temple, but they are being done in opposition to God's holiness, and they are taking the holiness that God has put within us and defiling it, making it tameh, making it ritually impure. So it is not the temple or tabernacle that is being sullied by this activity, but the person doing it is sullying the holiness that God has put within them. That spark of godliness that is found in all people is what is being contaminated by these types of ideas that lead to these behaviors. We'll come back more on this, but I want to also do categories 2 and 3. Category 2, the relying on such oracles as Ov and Yidoni have already been described as spiritually contaminating in 1931, Leviticus 19:31, with the words, "So do not seek to become spiritually contaminated by them." In 18:24 through 25, the Torah has already drawn attention to the fate which befalls the previous inhabitants of the land of Canaan, being due to their relying on such oracles. So even though it may seem like a small thing to have people involved in this type of necromantic fortune-telling and investigations, it likewise is also something that has a very negative effect on our spiritual activities. Everyone with me so far? Okay. Category number 3, the third category of spiritually counterproductive practices is the ingesting of the kind of food that the Torah outlawed in Leviticus chapter 11, meaning kosher food, and the negative results in violating these laws are repeated again in verse 25 of our chapter. Separate yourselves, do not become detestable to spiritually contaminate yourselves. So these three are held up as examples in chapter 20 of different activities that would counter, that would negate the holiness that God is putting within us and asking us to exemplify in chapter 19. And it's that juxtaposition that gives us a firmer understanding. Now, he loops back to our discussion of Molech for the end of his commentary. Here the Torah begins with the desecrating of one's progeny by sacrificing it to the abominable Molech cult. The penalty to be applied to people guilty of this sin, which is perpetrated in public, is the people at large are to stone the father to death. Only by the expression of zealousness on behalf of God can such a sin be wiped out, seeing it had a potentially spiritually negative effect on the entire nation. Naturally, the penalty by the hand of man is applied only if there was testimony by valid witnesses to the deed and the perpetrator had first been cautioned of the penalty to expect if he would go through with his intention. So that last sentence, of course, is a repeat of what we got from Rambam, but we always have to repeat this, that if this is going to be a capital case, that it needs to be properly witnessed and there had to be a proper warning given, and the person had to willfully go ahead and commit the act regardless of having been warned and knowing there were witnesses that would lead to this particular penalty. But the meat of his point here is that the practice of Molech and idolatry in general is insidious because it has an infective property beyond the individual. This is not about what one person chooses to do with their family. This is about what one person chooses to do in a public way that begins to infect the understanding, the ideas, the philosophy, the beliefs, the essence of the people around them. And idolatry is something very special that I think many in the modern world don't quite fathom as having this particular problem. Idolatry is a very contagious behavior. As humans, we are deeply attracted to the world around us, and we are deeply attracted to the means, the levers of control over the world around us. And idolatry promises that control. Idolatry promises that we will have the security that we crave, the certainty that we want, the feeling of power and authority over the world that will make us feel properly secure. But of course, that is wrong on two major problems, wrong for lots of reasons, but wrong in two major ways. One, there is no way to achieve the kind of certainty that a human being truly craves. And we must instead come to recognize that we are not going to ever have that level of certainty. And two, we have to recognize that by trying to achieve that certainty through a manipulation of the physical world or consulting spirits, etc., that what we are actually doing is saying that we feel that that control is more important than the holiness that should be guiding our actions in life. That our primary goal is to have control and power rather than our primary goal being the pursuit of holiness through a righteous and good life. Idolatry is that opposite direction, saying it doesn't matter how you live, it doesn't matter what kind of person you are, it doesn't matter how evil you are, as long as you do X, Y, and Z with this proper idol and that proper motion, then you will be able to secure whatever it is that your heart desires. And as such, idolatry truly is the antithesis of that main desire of Torah to put us on that right path, to put us on that right direction, by telling us that we have no need of living a good life, but only need to pursue our own desires, no matter how bad they may be, and to then use idolatry to manipulate the world to our benefit. We are removing ourselves entirely from the mission that Torah has set for us. And that's a pretty big deal. But you're probably still thinking, as I have when I've read this in the past, but come on, Molech, especially as Rambam described it, as not All right, and my router went down again. I really got to get that fixed. Okay, so let's bring this back up to the share screen and pick up where I left off. Okay. Hopefully you can see it again. Let's carry on. So as I was saying, we need to understand why Molech is being held up as this example of a problem when it is such a minor action. And for that, we are going to turn to Moreh Nevuchim, to the Guide for the Perplexed. We must also point out that originators of false, baseless, and useless principles scheme and plan for the firm establishment of their faith, and tell their fellow men that a certain plague will befall those who will not perform the act by which that faith is supported and confirmed forever. So this is the insidiousness of chain letters and other nonsense of, if you don't continue this, then you will have, some tragedy in your life. This is the curse of the fortune tellers around the world for the last thousands and thousands of years. That you first induce fear in order to establish the lie, the action that you are trying to implement. That you are at first and foremost telling someone the tragedy that's going to happen if they don't act now and follow whatever silly thing it is you're telling them to do. This plague may one day accidentally befall a person who will then direct his attention to the performance of that act and adopt idolatry. How many people, when they've been told, from their fortune cookie that, there's going to be a tragedy, not that most fortune cookies have negative things, and how many of those who have been cursed or warned by some internet post that, something bad will happen, that when something bad does happen, they automatically assume it must be the fulfillment of that chain letter I didn't send on, and then become much more careful in the performance of that kind of activity. That is the first step to idolatry. Generate fear, generate remorse, and then promise a cure to prevent it from the future. So how does this work in practice? It being well known that people are naturally most in fear and dread of the loss of their property and their children, the two things people value the most, the worshippers of fire spread the tale that if anyone did not pass his son and daughter through the fire, his children will die. On account of this absurd menace, everyone at once obeyed, out of pity and sympathy for the child, especially as it was a trifling and light thing that was demanded. That last line is very important from Rambam's analysis, that what was being asked for was something trivial. Come on, we're not asking you to hurt the kid. We're not asking you to harm or damage the child, because we know that that is not something most parents are willing to do, at least at first. It's something trivial. But do this little thing, and that way your child will live. And honestly, if you thought there was a chance this might help your child live, wouldn't you do something so insignificant just to make sure, just to hedge your bets? Because after all, how silly would you feel if you didn't pass your child through the fire and then they died? You would feel like you had completely betrayed your child. And this form of convincing, this form of tricking people into obedience is repeated not only with Molech, but in countless other forms of idolatry over the centuries. We must further take into account, and you can hold on to the comments here, that the care of young children is entrusted to women, who are generally weak-minded and ready to believe everything, as is well known. Rambam, unfortunately, was a product of his century, which is 1,000 years ago. And unfortunately, he had inherited a certain variety of misogyny, which held women as being intellectually and emotionally less capable than men. This is not rooted in Torah itself, but this was rooted within the culture of Egypt in the century that he lived. Now, his general point that parents are, of course, passionate in the protection of their children, I can say does feel true. That many parents are so desperate for any assurance that this precious thing that they hold in their arms, this beautiful child, will grow up to have health and happiness, that they will look for anything that promises some form of protection or benefit. Parents will go to great lengths to protect their children. There is a certain parental irrationality when it comes to how far they're willing to go in order to safeguard their children. And oftentimes that irrationality leads them to, well, it's in the word, not behave rationally. I don't think this is a uniquely female predilection, but then again, I didn't live 1,000 years ago and I don't have those biases that Rambam did. The law makes therefore a stand against this practice and uses in reference to it stronger terms than in any other kind of idolatry. Namely, he defiles my sanctuary and profanes my holy name. So Rambam takes this in a different line than our initial discussion in Seforno, and says that this is being used as a form of condemnation of this mild idolatry in order to highlight the insidiousness of it. The true prophet, meaning Moses, then declares in the name of God that the very act which is performed for the purpose of keeping the child alive will bring death upon him who performs it, and destruction upon his seed. As it says, and I will set my face against that man and against his family. Know that the traces of this practice have survived even to the present day, because it was widespread in the world. Now, present day for him was the 11th century Egypt. You can see how midwives take a young child wrapped in its swaddling clothes, and after having placed incense of a disagreeable smell on the fire, swing the child and the smoke over that fire. This is certainly a kind of passing children through the fire, and we must not do it. Reflect on the evil cunning of the author of this doctrine, how people continued to adhere to this doctrine, and how in spite of the opposition of the law during thousands of years, its name is not blotted out, and its traces are still in existence. So Rambam was deeply frustrated that even though Molech by name was no longer being worshipped in the ancient world, in his classical world of Egypt in the time of Islam, that people still had the custom, they still had the practice that was derivative of this notion of passing a child through the fire. And he is incensed, if you'll pardon the pun, with this continuation, because it is precisely this type of superstitious behavior that is the thin end of the wedge, the slippery slope, that leads a person down that path of idolatry. It is precisely because we think it is trivial and unimportant that we do it anyway, even though we know it's in opposition to what Torah teaches, that allows idolatry to continue to fester. Maybe not with the giant statues to Zeus or Baal, but certainly within the superstitious mindset and the irrationality of many people who look for some palliative cure to whatever might be their fear. And that is a danger, because once we begin to give in to the idea that we can find these panaceas within the rituals and acts which have no foundation within logic, reason, or our faith, then we open ourselves up to every possible form of corruption and oppression that comes within an idolatrous society. Because once there is no check, once there is no way to examine or confirm the benefit to this action for the society, then anyone can propose anything, and those with power can enforce anything, claiming that, of course, they are doing it for the good of the children, that they are doing it for the good of society, and that no one has any right to question or wonder whether or not this is right or wrong, because, of course, it is not susceptible to logical investigation. It is always known that swinging the child through fire is what is important. That type of infectious idolatry is unfortunately not gone away. People still will spout nonsense in the name of defending children. and often do so in ways that prevent the actual protection of actual children. And this shows the problem as it continues to be in our society, and why we have to be sure to be looking at Torah for our moral guidance, to reason and logic and proper investigation for guidance in its application. And yes, idolatry may seem trivial, and even swinging a child through some smoke may seem trivial. But once this is embraced and allowed, then all bets are off on where it goes from there. Questions or comments? You've all been very quiet today. I know YouTube is now catching up because of the delay, but hopefully those of you that are actually in the live stream Zoom are still with me in the real-time discussion. But if there are no other questions, then we will wrap it up there. All right. Again, my apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm going to have some words with the manufacturer. Take care, everyone.
Well. One quick question. Oh, shoot.
Oh, no, I'm still here. I'm still here. What's the question?
I hesitate to ask this question, but I can't help but notice that these are the scriptures that are typically used to attempt to outlaw abortion, and that with everything happening right now, it's kind of coincidental that this is where we're at. Is that something that you feel, or that, I don't know about you, but is correct or a valid way to be interpreting this about the references to Molech?
I have never heard anyone try to use the Molech argument as,
as an
abortion argument. No, I'm afraid I haven't come across that novel interpretation.
Novel.
Well, it's novel because in Jewish law, a child is not a child until the child is born. And so, passing a pregnant mother through smoke would not be serving Molech. That would still be silly if it was idolatry, but it wouldn't be nothing to do with the state of the child. It would just be another superstitious activity.
Okay.
But I will actually be speaking about abortion in Jewish law and Jewish life more extensively this coming Shabbat, because I think now, apparently, it is very important that we speak on this so people understand the traditional Jewish opinion, which I am proud to say annoys everyone within the American camps, but which I believe needs to be properly defended in order for us to be able to practice our faith, which does inform our behaviors. But I'll go into that in much more detail on Shabbat.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Okay. How about you? You got a thing?
Oh, wait. I'm sorry. Wait, Joel, did you have a question?
Yes. I got a question about the slave woman. That woman. That's not part of the Behemoth. And the Behemoth, we talk about the feasting woman. It's prohibited, right?
You mean the discussion on the Talmud section that we're reading now?
Yeah.
Okay. That I'm going to say we'll save for our Sunday review.
No. But my question only is the slave woman that we're talking about, the Torah talking about, and that's part of the Behemoth too.
I'm afraid I can't quite understand what you're saying through the car speaker.
Okay, I saw it. I'll send my question for the Sunday.
Okay, that's fine. I'll get you an answer during our discussion.
And Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, Joseph.
I was gonna comment that what we were studying, I don't know why I was thinking in the back of my head, that it parallels today to the doom and gloom prophets, that they say that we're going to doom, that we have to do certain things to prepare to be saved. And it's very similar to to what Rambam is talking about here.
Absolutely. Anytime anyone tells you, to take these important steps to avoid God's wrath, when in fact all they are spouting is superstitious nonsense, it is falling into the same trap of serving Molech. God has laid out very clearly what is asked of us for living a good and moral life, and it doesn't involve this kind of passing through fire, superstition kind of thing. And it's a very important inoculation against idolatry and against moving off in a direction other than what God has tried to chart for us as our course.
Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate it.
All right. One more time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.